My next guest is an attorney, a former U.S. Supreme Court law clerk, and a New York Times best-selling author. He's directed a lifelong interest in archaeology and early Christian history into a new book. It's called The Fisherman's Tomb, the true story of the Vatican's secret search. It's about the discovery of the remains of the Apostle St. Peter. Welcome to the program, John O'Neill, who joins us from Houston, Texas. John, thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, Raymond.
I want to start with where this story really begins. In 1939, a workman is digging beneath St. Peter's. They're looking, the basilica that is, they're looking for a tomb for Pius XI. What happens?
He began to dig. Pius XI wanted to be buried under the Vatican, which was fairly unusual. They began digging out an altar for him, and the workman took probably the most important fall in the history of archaeology. He fell 20-some feet down, and all of a sudden he was in a huge room full of fantastic Roman murals and great Roman statuary. Absolutely astounding. They summoned the man who would become Pius XII, and they moved a little further, and they found the most amazing thing of all, Raymond. They found the tomb of a Christian woman marked with a fish symbol, marked with the symbol of the Samaritan woman pouring grace, and with the words Requiesce and Pace. Now this is in the 2nd century, only 400 yards from the Roman emperor's palace. The Romans at this time are killing the Christians every place they can find them, and there are no, or virtually no, Christian inscriptions anywhere, so it was an astounding discovery.
Now, tell me what happens here. Pius XII comes to the throne of St. Peter. He decides, because he knew, obviously, the pious legend and the story, that Constantine built St. Peter's atop the tomb of St. Peter the Apostle, but no one dared challenge that. I mean, that was kind of it was considered at the time nothing more than a pious legend.
Exactly. The church had tried twice, in roughly 1500 and 1600, to find Peter under the Vatican. Both efforts ended in failure. They revealed only pagan graves, and so people were very worried that Peter really wasn't there. And of course, this is a search for a needle in a haystack, but Pius had absolutely no doubt he'd find him. He lined up financing from a wealthy anonymous Catholic donor who's detailed in the book, and they began searching right in the middle of World War II, with the fascists right outside the Vatican, later the Nazis, and they began doing it with hand tools under terribly difficult conditions. What they found was a city of one Roman tomb after another, huge room-sized tombs, some of the greatest Roman artwork and statuary in the world, but they didn't find Peter right then. So they decided to go immediately to the center of St. Peter's, that is, if you dropped a plumb bob from the top. And they found probably the most curious structure in the history of archaeology there.
Yeah.
A series of altars, one inside another.
Yeah, let's get to that in a minute, because there's a lot there to explore. Tell me about this George Strake. Now, he's an oil man. He's a bit of a wildcatter, not unlike Pius XII, we might add, who authorized this scavi, this excavation beneath St. Peter's. How did he come into the picture?
He discovered the 3rd largest oil field ever discovered on Earth, and he believed that God had given him that oil field, and he described himself as a wildcatter with God on his shoulder. And he believed that his job was to return all that money during his life anonymously, taking no credit. So he became a tremendous donor to special projects of Pius XII and other projects like hospitals, schools, universities, but particularly Pius XII's causes. And so he is the man who provided tremendous financing for this entire excavation,
now,
secretly.
This
he was
goes
told
on.
no one would ever know.
Why was it a secret, John? Why did Pius XII consider it necessary for this to be a secret? And it was kept, the world was kept in the dark about this really for a decade.
Well, one big reason was that the fascists who controlled Rome thought themselves to be the successors to the Romans. They could have cared less about Peter, and they probably would have seized control of the digs if they had even known about it. Moreover, Of course, Pius was very worried about a false claim of success leaking out, or a premature claim of failure. He simply wanted to ensure that that the information was accurate when it was revealed, and that it wasn't handed over into the hands of a despot, whether the fascists, the Nazis, and later the communists who threatened to take control in Rome.
Now, in 1949, there was a huge flood in Rome, and it filled this underground cemetery. And the way that it was explained to me, because I've been on that Scavi tour several times where they take you beneath St. Peter's, it's almost like one of our above-ground cemeteries in New Orleans. But what happened here is they sort of packed the earth on top of it and built the first basilica there. Is that correct?
That's exactly what happened. Constantine couldn't knock over these family tombs. If he had done that, there would have been a revolution in Rome. And so in roughly 300, what he did was fill this whole hill, originally a hill, to level it off. And that buried for all time the Roman tombs, and buried also the grave of St. Peter in order to make it flat and construct the first basilica. He constructed the exact center of the basilica over what proved to be Peter's grave.
Now tell me about Margarita Guarducci. Now she's an archaeologist, and her specialty is really studying ancient inscriptions. She's brought in because these tombs are found, and this one particular box with all kind of graffiti on it. What does she discover? What's her role in this drama?
She was the whole story in the end, and one of the most inspiring people that I've ever read about. She was brought in by Pius XII. She was an agnostic when she was brought in. She was probably the greatest archaeologist of the 20th century. She reported to Pius that the excavation had been poorly handled. He removed the people who had been involved in it and placed Guarducci in complete control. Imagine a woman in 1951 being placed in control of this entire excavation. She was a genius. She spent years studying the inscriptions, which had been dismissed as meaningless. In fact, she found out that these were coded Christian inscriptions, indeed the most profound early Christian inscriptions in the world. They speak in code, Raymond, like Peter is two keys, and then there'll be a line, and then a T, like a Roman cross, and then another line with victory, with a V for victory or an R for redemption. And so these are incredibly important because they actually incorporate the very same things that we learn today in church. She found a wall called the graffiti wall that everyone had dismissed as meaningless. It was 18 inches from the exact center of the basilica. It had 20-some different inscriptions to Peter, prayers in effect for Peter's intercession. And then she found two inscriptions that said Peter is near and Peter is within. And she learned that inside that wall, in a marble niche, they had found bones, sent them off to storage and not tested them. She sent the bones to the greatest forensic anthropologist in the world for testing. They were the bones of a 60 to 70-year-old man. He had been crucified upside down. His feet were cut off. He had nail marks. He was covered in a purple and gold cloth from the 1st century. And he was put into that wall and then buried under hundreds of tons of rubble around 250 A.D. She had found Peter, Raymond. That's the conclusion of virtually every scientific expert and forensic person that has looked at it.
Now, the initial reports, I know there was one expert that looked at it, you talk about him in the book. When they first analyzed the bones, they said these are the bones of a woman, a man, and animal bones. What's the discrepancy
that was
here?
Well, the discrepancy is that next to a trophy, they found a set of bones in 1942, and they immediately assumed that those were Peter's. Only when Guarducci caused them to be tested did they learn those were the bones of a woman. It took Guarducci another 7 years of decrypting and then testing to get the true bones, the bones that had been placed in the wall niche immediately next to that trophy around 250 A.D. And she published these findings around 1963, and Pope Paul VI agreed with her and published it forward to her book and announced that Peter's relics had indeed been recovered.
Now, John, in 2004, you were a New York Times best-selling author. You vowed you'd never write again after that. Why this story? And tell me the personal story of your cancer diagnosis and how that hastened your desire to make sure this story was told?
Well, I really am not much of a public person, Raymond. I sort of enjoy just sort of my family and stuff. But in and after writing the 2004 book, I wasn't never going to write again. However, I happened upon this story. I knew the Strikes. I learned about the story of Margarita Garducci. I had wonderful Michael Novak showed me through what was the beginning of the Scavi tour in Rome, and I knew this was a story that people really needed to know. I dithered. I got 4 different kinds of cancer. I nearly died from cancer and MRSA. My doctor still calls me Mr. 5%. And what really happened is God gave me the time to actually write this book. And I considered it so important that people learn, first, that St. Peter is not Santa Claus. There was a real St. Peter. He was located, he was crucified by Nero, as Tacitus describes, in 66 AD. He was buried under the Vatican. The great church was erected over him. And most of all, that those early Christians, who could have been killed at any time for what they were scratching in rock, believed exactly the same things that we believed. And so thank goodness and thank God I had the chance to write the book, and that's why I wrote it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book, and really revives figures that have been forgotten or might be in danger of being forgotten. Tell me, of all the stories surrounding St. Peter's death and burial, what surprised you most when you begin delving into this topic and researching the story?
The most amazing thing that I learned about the go-between in financing and much outside stuff was a priest named Father Walter Carroll, completely forgotten today. Walter Carroll ran the so-called Rome line that saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of Italian Jews. With money from the United States, he actually was the very first person after American troops into Dachau and Buchenwald and concentration camps to help Jewish survivors. In 1945-46, they started small churches in communist areas in order to give people an alternative to communism in Italy. And he appeared over and over again. He was an unbelievable man. He probably saved Rome in 1944. The Allies were considering bombing it because they had lost 42,000 dead, captured, wounded on the Anzio beachhead 30 miles from Rome. He met over several times with Franklin Roosevelt, with Beadle Smith, with Matt Clark, and as Matt Clark said, he probably changed the whole course of World War II. He's completely forgotten, except I like to think of him as the man who saved Rome. And there's a great tower erected to him at Sacred Heart Parish in Pittsburgh, built by his friend George Strait.
John, before I let you go, I've heard the story when visiting Rome. The tradition was always that in the canopy, which is the big baldacchino above the altar at St. John Lateran, there are 2 statues, bronzes or gold statues, and within them are supposedly the skulls of St. Peter and St. Paul. Now, I have been told by folks who took me down to the Scavi and by researchers at the Vatican that when they took the bones discovered in the graffiti wall that you talked about earlier, and then the skull, purportedly that of St. Peter's, the DNA matched between the skull and the bones. Have you come across that in your study?
I haven't yet, actually. That is a fact I was unaware of, Raymond, and it must reflect a test, fairly recently.
Yeah, I think it's only been in the last maybe 10 years or so.
It's very, very clear. The most powerful evidence, other than the exact location, the fact that the cathedral was built over it, that there are first century popes buried around it, the most compelling evidence is the forensic evidence itself. You would have to believe that early Christians, sort of on a lark, had buried a man after crucifying him upside down because his feet were cut off and the nail marks were there, and had put him in a wall to somehow mislead everyone, and then covered it with rock for 1,700 years, marking in code the only way to get to him. So, I'm a lawyer. That's a case I'll try anytime. It's 100%er. That's Peter.
The other thing that people don't realize, when you go on the Scavi tour, you can see the external remnants, the columns and the walls of the Constantine Basilica, which is buried beneath the current St. Peter's. People don't realize that. I mean, that evidence is there. So, you know, as you walk around, you do see the outlines of that basilica, which took my breath away the first time I saw it.
What amazed me the very first time I saw it were the magnificence of these Roman tombs, unbelievable, with the pictures of the Euripides plays and great statuary, and then the very simple little Christian graves, including that of Paul VI, who of course was buried there, whose final words were, "Bury me near Peter in the simple earth." And I think it reflected the difference in attitude. The Romans believed that this was the end of everything, and the Christians believed it was simply a way station, and they would move on. That's why I wrote the Fisherman's Tomb, hopefully to bring that story to everybody.
Why have you chosen to contribute all the proceeds from this book to the relief of persecuted Christians in the Middle East?
I got very involved with Christian refugees in Irfan who were fleeing ISIS. Their children had been, if they were males, had been killed. Their daughters, terrible things were done to. Many of them were crucified. It was exactly what the Christians underwent in Nero's Rome, and in Rome up until the end of Diocletian, and very much like what Hitler did to people, to the Jews, and to many Catholic priests, actually. And it just, to me, cries out for help. And so that was a great cause that I could give to, and maybe I could emulate in my own small way George Drake, who gave everything. It's certainly a wonderful cause today. The great Catholic Relief has done wonderful work in Irfan, and the U.S. government, until recently, was totally absent.
Thank you, John O'Neill, for being here. The book is The Fisherman's Tomb, the true story of the Vatican's secret search. It's available at bookstores everywhere and online.